Hi everyone. This is my landscape, my mathematics landscape, and I chose to make mine kind of look like a fairy garden. So I want to start with the memory I have of the importance of keeping track when counting. This was a realization I remember having. I'm sure I had done it a little bit when I was younger, but in first grade, when I learned how to count money, I realized if you lost your place, you would have to start all over again. So I decided to, when I was counting my pennies, group them into groups of 10. So that brings me to the second term I wanted to talk about, which was making tens, because then I could just say 10 cents, 20 cents, and so on. Um, Another thing that I wanted to talk about was the one on one correspondence, which is the ability to see that one item gets counted once. Uh, an activity that we have at the preschool where I work is the children can take these little beads from a jar and put them on pipe cleaners. And whenever they show us what they've done afterward, we ask them, "Oh, how many beads did you put on that pipe cleaner?" And sometimes children count really quickly, and so they kind of skip beads and they say there's 8 beads when there were actually 20 beads. Um, and we can tell that they've achieved understanding one on one correspondence when they correctly count each bead only once and they say, "Oh, there were 10 beads on here," or whatever the answer is. And they're correct. And compensation, this was a technique or a strategy that I used a lot when I was learning addition. Um, I didn't like adding numbers that didn't fit well together, like 8 and 7, but I loved adding 9 to things. So instead of doing 8 plus 7, I would just move the numbers around a little bit so I could get a 9 in there. So I would do 9 plus 6 instead of 8 plus 7 because it was just easier for my brain that way. Um, Counting on, this is the technique of when you need to add two numbers together, you start with the first number and just count up from there. So, one of my students who's older was trying to figure out what 5 plus 7 was. So she held up 5 fingers and started lifting another finger and counting up to 7 to find it out that way. And the cardinality right here, this is when a child is able to count a certain amount of items and they know whatever number they land on, that's how many they are. So in my classroom, one of my students was playing with plastic butterflies. And I said, "How many butterflies do you have there?" And they were able to go one, two butterflies. Subitizing, this is a really fun idea. It's something that we all do. It's when you're able to look at something and know immediately what's there without having to actually count it. So, one of my students is able to, I noticed this with one of my students when they were playing with buttons and sorting them by color. I was able to say, "Okay, how many blue buttons do you have?" And they could say two without counting. "And how many pink buttons do you have?" And they could say three without counting. And I noticed that got more difficult with larger numbers. Um, and I just started paying more attention to that throughout the year with all of my students. Um, how many numbers, how many items can a child count without actually counting? How many can they know are there? This is subitizing. Um, And then skip counting. I have a fun memory from second grade with skip counting. I went to school in Oklahoma, and some of the kids had a kind of a southern accent. And when they say that long I and five, it's like ah, like five. And when we learned to count by fives, the kids thought it was funny. Like they were aware, like some of us say this with an accent, and uh they would exaggerate it. Like the whole class would, even though not all of us had a southern accent, we would all do that just because it sounded funny when we would count together. So we would skip count by fives, and every time we said the word five, we'd drag it out like 25, 30, 35, like that. And I don't know why, but we just thought that was really funny. And I think of it whenever I have to count by fives or anything now.